Hi, welcome to Danny After Dark. If you're new here, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss a notification or a new episode. Tonight, I'll be featuring the case of Ronald DeFeo Jr. This will be part one in a two-part series. So let's go ahead and find out more. Let's go ahead and dive on in. Ronald Joseph DeFeo Jr., otherwise known as Butch, was born on September 26, 1951. He was tried and convicted for the 1974 killings of his father, mother, two brothers, and two sisters. The case is notable for being the real-life inspiration behind the book and the film versions of the Amityville Horror. But do you know what happens, the murders that occurred in that house? Well, let's go ahead and find out more. The DeFeo family purchased 112 Ocean Avenue in 1965. As a young boy, Butch was overweight, unpopular, and bullied by other children. His father encouraged him to stick up for himself. However, that did not apply to how Butch was treated at home. Ronald Sr. had no tolerance for backtalk, disobedience, and he kept Butch on a very short leash. He refused to let him stand up for himself at home the way he encouraged him to do at school. As Butch matured into adolescence, he grew in size and strength. He was no longer going to tolerate his father's abuse. Shouting matches often came to blows with little provocation. Ronald Sr. and his wife arranged for Butch to visit a psychiatrist, but Butch simply employed a passive-aggressive stance with his therapist, and he rejected the notion that he needed any help. With nothing working, the DeFeos tried a new strategy for their unruly child, and that was to buy Butch anything he wanted and give him money anytime he asked. At the age of 14, his father presented him with a $14,000 speedboat to cruise the Amityville River. Whenever Butch wanted money, all he had to do was ask. And if he wasn't in the mood to ask, he would simply just take it. By the age of 17, Butch was forced to leave the school he was attending. He began using drugs such as heroin, LSD, and he started getting involved in petty theft. His violent behavior was becoming increasingly psychotic, and his outbursts were no longer limited to within his home. At the age of 18, Butch was given a job at his grandfather's Buick dealership. Regardless of whether he showed up to work or not, he received cash from his father at the end of each week. He would then use that cash for his car, again, that his parents purchased for him, or use it to buy alcohol and drugs, anything he wanted. Fights between Butch and his father were becoming more and more frequent, and they were becoming more and more violent. For example, one evening, a fight broke out between Mr. and Mrs. DeFeo. Butch, being home at the time, grabbed a 12-gauge shotgun from his room, loaded a shell into the chamber, and charged downstairs to the scene of the altercation. Without hesitating or yelling to break up the fight, Butch pointed the barrel of the gun at his father's face. Now Butch pulled the trigger, but the gun did not go off. Ronald Sr. was frozen in place, and he watched in shock as his son simply lowered the gun and walked out of the room with a casual indifference to the fact that he had almost just killed him. Now, 2 weeks before the murders, Butch was sent on an errand by one of the staff from the Buick dealership. He was given the task of depositing $1,800 in cash and $20,000 in checks into the bank. Instead, Butch arranged to be, quote, robbed, end quote, on his way to the bank by an acquaintance with whom he would later just split the money with. Ronald Sr. was at the dealership when Butch returned, and he exploded with rage when he heard his story. So the police were called, and when they arrived, they spoke to Butch. He became tense and irritable with the police. But that wasn't all. He then became outright violent as they began to suspect that he was lying, and their questions started to focus on the 2 hours he was away. Butch began to curse at them, banging on the hood of his car in his grandfather's lot to emphasize his rage. The police backed off for the moment, but Ronald Sr. had come to his own conclusion about his son's behavior. On the Friday before the murders, Butch had been asked by police to examine some mugshots in the possibility that he might be able to help identify the robber. Butch initially agreed, but he pulled out at the last minute. When Ronald Sr. heard of this, he confronted his son at work and demanded to know why wouldn't he cooperate with the police. Butch ran to his car and simply just sped off. November 13th, 1974. In the early morning hours in the DeFeo home, all of the family members were in bed, except for Butch, as he sat in the quiet of his room. His father and his family would be a nuisance to him no longer. Butch grabbed his .35 caliber rifle from his closet and walked towards his parents' bedroom. He quietly pushed open the door to their bedroom and without hesitation raised the rifle to his shoulder and pulled the trigger. The first shot went into his father's back, tearing through his kidney and exiting through his chest. Butch fired another round, again hitting his father in the back, piercing the base of Ronald Sr.'s spine and lodging in his neck. Well, by now, Mrs. DeFeo had awoken, and immediately Butch aimed the rifle at his mother and fired 2 shots into her body. The bullets shattered her ribcage and collapsed her right lung. Butch's 2 younger brothers, John and Mark, would be next. He entered their bedroom, as the 2 boys shared a bedroom, and he stood between their 2 beds. Butch fired 1 shot into each of the boys as they lay sleeping. Butch then went to the next bedroom, and that was a room that his 2 sisters, Dawn and Allison, shared. Dawn was the closest in age to Butch, while Allison was still in grade school, along with John and Mark. As Butch entered the room, Allison, she woke up, and she looked up just as Butch lowered the rifle to her face and pulled the trigger. Butch then aimed his weapon at Dawn's head and pulled the trigger, literally blowing off the side of her face. It was just after 3 o'clock a.m., In less than 15 minutes, Butch had killed his entire family. And that is the end of part 1 of Ronald DeFeo Jr. Thank you for sticking around for another episode of Danny After Dark. Make sure to tune in next week so you can get the conclusion of this case. Do you have any questions about the case thus far? Well, leave a comment. Let's be interactive. Do you have a suggestion for a case that you'd like me to cover? Well, leave it down below, and you may see it featured in an upcoming episode. Until next time, remember, we don't live in darkness. Darkness lives in us.